They said a man who hides an Apache child won't live long enough to regret it. But Ethan Cole had already made his choice before the warning ever reached him. The wind moved slow across the dry plains that evening, carrying dust like whispers between the fence posts, and Ethan stood alone beside a broken water trough, watching his cattle drift lazily in the last stretch of fading light, the kind of silence that comes when a man has been forgotten long enough to start forgetting himself. He heard her before he saw her, not a cry, not a call, just the faint sound of something shifting against stone down by the creek about 50 yards past the ridge, subtle enough that most men would have missed it, but Ethan had spent too many years listening to things that didn't want to be heard. His hand rested near his belt, not on the gun, just close enough to remember it was there, as he made his way down the slope, boots pressing into dry dirt that hadn't seen rain in weeks, the air carrying that familiar scent of leather, dust, and something else now, something unfamiliar. She was small, smaller than he expected, crouched near the edge of the water where the creek bent around a cluster of rocks, her reflection broken by the slow current, dark hair hanging loose, tangled with dust and travel, her shoulders tight like she expected the world to strike first. She didn't look up when he approached, not at first, and that was the first thing that told him she wasn't just lost, she was waiting. Ethan stopped 10 feet away, enough distance to show he wasn't a threat, enough to leave himself an exit if he was wrong. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the quiet push of water against stone and the distant creak of wood from his ranch behind him. Then she lifted her eyes, and something in that look held him there longer than it should have. Not fear, not exactly, but something deeper, something that carried knowledge a child shouldn't have to carry. "You alone?" he asked, voice low, steady, the kind of tone you use with something fragile or something dangerous. It wasn't always clear which was which out here. She didn't answer right away, just studied him, measuring, weighing as if deciding whether he belonged to the kind of men she had already learned to avoid, and then she gave the smallest nod, barely there, but enough. Ethan's gaze dropped then, not by accident, and that's when he saw it, the necklace resting against her collarbone, silver worn smooth by time, a small turquoise stone set in the center, catching what little light remained. Something about it tightened his chest in a way he couldn't explain, like recognizing a face you hadn't seen in years but couldn't place, and for a second he forgot to breathe. He looked back up at her, slower this time. "You hurt?" he asked, and she hesitated before answering, like the truth itself was something that cost her. "No," she said softly, though her voice carried the weight of someone who had learned not to admit when they were. The sky darkened another shade, shadows stretching longer across the creek, and Ethan glanced back toward the ridge, toward the distant outline of his cabin, then back at her again, and that was the moment, the quiet one, the kind no one ever sees, where man decides the direction of everything that comes after. He knew what she was. He knew what helping her meant. This land remembered things. People talked, and out here, being on the wrong side of story could cost more than a man had to give. The wind shifted again, colder now, brushing past them both, and the girl's shoulders tightened just slightly, enough that he caught it, enough that it settled something inside him he hadn't felt in a long time. He stepped back once, just enough to break the tension, and jerked his head toward the ridge. "Got a place up there," he said, simple, no promise in it, no pressure either. "Food. Water. You can stay the night." She didn't move at first, just watched him. The silence stretched. Then slowly, carefully, she stood, her bare feet finding steady ground like she'd done this 1,000 times before, and without another word, she followed. The walk back was quiet, the kind of quiet that says more than talking ever could, the fading light turning everything gold for just a few seconds before the dark settled in for good. Ethan didn't look back at her, not once, but he could feel her there, a few steps behind, light, careful, like she wasn't sure. She was allowed to leave a mark on the ground she walked. When they reached the cabin, he pushed the door open with a slow creak, stepping inside first, the scent of old wood and fire ash greeting him like it always did, familiar, steady, safe. He lit the lantern near the table, the flame catching after a second, filling the room with soft, flickering light that pushed the shadows into the corners. She stepped in after him, stopping just inside the doorway, eyes scanning everything, not curious, careful, always careful. Ethan grabbed a tin cup, filled it with water from the barrel, and set it on the table without looking at her. "Drink," he said. She didn't reach for it right away. Instead, her hand moved to the necklace at her throat, fingers brushing the silver like it mattered more than anything else she carried. Ethan noticed. He didn't say anything, but something in his chest tightened again, sharper this time, because he had seen that necklace before. Not on a child. Not out here. And as the wind pressed softly against the cabin walls and the lantern flame flickered just enough to make the shadows move, Ethan Cole realized that whatever had followed this girl to his land hadn't arrived yet. The girl did not touch the water until Ethan turned away, and even then, he heard the faint scrape of the tin cup against the wood, slow, cautious, like she expected it might disappear if she moved too quickly. He leaned against the far wall, arms folded, eyes on the lantern, but mind somewhere else entirely, replaying the image of that silver necklace in the fading light by the creek, the way it had caught the sun like it belonged to another place, another time. He had seen it before. He was certain of that now. Not in passing, not in some distant memory blurred by years, but clear, sharp, tied to a face he had not allowed himself to think about in a long time. The girl drank in small sips, never taking her eyes off him, and when she finished, she placed the cup back exactly where it had been, as if careful not to disturb anything that did not belong to her. "What is your name?" Ethan asked after a while, his voice steady, neutral, giving her space to choose whether to answer or not. She hesitated again, that same pause, that same quiet calculation, and then she said Lila. The name settled into the room like something fragile, something that needed to be handled with care. Ethan nodded once, accepting it without question, even though he knew names out here were not always the truth. "You got family, Lila?" he asked, not pressing, just letting the question sit between them. Her fingers moved again to the necklace, brushing it lightly, and for a second her expression shifted, something softer, something almost like memory passing through her eyes before it disappeared again. "Yes," she said, but nothing more. Ethan let the silence return. Outside, the wind pressed harder now, rattling the loose shutter against the side of the cabin, a hollow sound that echoed through the wood like a warning that had not yet found its meaning. He pushed off the wall and crossed to the small stove, adding a piece of dry wood to the coals, the faint crackle filling the space between them. "You can sleep there," he said, nodding toward the narrow bed in the corner. "I will take the chair." She looked at the bed, then back at him, uncertainty flickering across her face. "I will not take it from you," she said quietly, and something about the way she said it made Ethan pause, because it did not sound like politeness. It sounded like a rule she had learned somewhere else. "It is just a bed," he replied, simple, firm, leaving no room for argument. She did not respond, but after a moment, she moved toward it, slow steps, careful, like every movement had to be chosen. Ethan sat in the chair by the door, hat low, boots still on, the kind of rest a man learns when he does not expect the night to stay quiet. He did not sleep right away. Instead, he watched the shadows shift along the walls, the lantern light flickering just enough to make everything feel slightly unsteady, and his mind kept returning to that necklace. A turquoise stone wrapped in silver wire, worn smooth at the edges. He had seen it years ago, on a woman who stood on the edge of town and made men lower their voices without saying a word. Margaret Halle. The name came back to him slow, like something pulled from deep water, and with it came the memory of the way people spoke about her, never directly, never with certainty, just enough to suggest that she was not someone you crossed paths with lightly. He had not seen her in years. Most people said she had left. Some said she had never been part of the town to begin with. Ethan had never cared enough to find out which was true. Until now, he shifted in the chair, the wood creaking softly under his weight, and glanced toward the bed. Lila was lying still, eyes open, staring at the ceiling as if sleep was something she had not yet decided to trust. "You are not running anymore," he said quietly, not a question, more like an observation placed gently into the air. She did not turn her head. "I stopped," she answered, and there was something in those two words that carried more than distance, more than exhaustion. It carried choice. Ethan nodded to himself, though she could not see it. Outside, the sound of hooves drifted faintly across the open land, distant but unmistakable, the rhythm steady, deliberate, not the scattered movement of cattle or the wandering path of a lone rider. More than one. Ethan's gaze shifted to the door instantly, every sense sharpening in that quiet, practiced way that came from years of living where trouble did not announce itself twice. Lila heard it too. He could tell by the way her body tensed, the way her hand closed around the necklace at her throat. Neither of them spoke. The sound grew slightly clearer, still far, but moving in a direction that did not leave much to question. Toward the ridge, toward the cabin. Ethan stood slowly, no sudden movements, and reached for the lantern, lowering the flame until the room dimmed, shadows stretching longer across the floor. "Stay here," he said, voice low, controlled, and this time she did not hesitate. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him with care. The night air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of dust stirred by movement somewhere beyond the dark. He stood on the porch, eyes scanning the horizon where the land met the sky, and for a long moment there was nothing, just wind, just silence. Then, far off, a shape moved against the darkness. Then another. Riders. Not rushing. Not lost. Coming with purpose. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but he did not reach for his gun. Not yet, because something about the way they moved, the spacing, the calm, told him this was not a search. It was a message, and as he stood there, the wind brushing past him like a quiet warning, Ethan Cole understood one thing with absolute clarity. The girl inside his cabin had not just been found. She had been followed. The riders did not hurry, and that was what unsettled him most, because men who feared being seen did not ride in straight lines across open land under a sky this clear. Ethan stood still on the porch, one hand resting lightly against the doorframe, feeling the grain of the wood under his palm as if it might anchor him to something certain, while the shapes in the distance grew slowly larger, clearer, real. There were 3 of them, maybe 4, spaced evenly, their horses moving at a steady pace that spoke of control, not urgency, and even from this distance Ethan could tell they were not from the town. Town riders carried a kind of restlessness, a need to prove something with every mile. These men did not. They moved like they already knew where they were going and why. Behind him, inside the cabin, the faint creak of the floor told him Lila had shifted, likely standing now, listening the same way he was, her world narrowing to the sound of hooves and the space between each beat. Ethan did not turn back. Not yet. His eyes stayed on the horizon, tracking the rhythm, counting the seconds between each step of the horses, measuring distance the way a man learns to do when the land itself becomes his only map. 50 yards closer now, maybe less. The wind carried a faint scent of leather and something older, something like smoke that had settled in a cloth long ago and never quite left. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him steady, controlled, though his thoughts had begun to shift into that quiet place where instinct spoke louder than reason. He had a choice. He could step back inside, bar the door, pretend the world beyond his fence line had nothing to do with him. He had done it before, many times. Or he could stay where he was, meet whatever was coming with his eyes open, and accept that some things, once they reach your land, were already part of your story whether you wanted them or not. The riders reached the base of the ridge and slowed, their silhouettes clearer now in the dim light. Hats low, shoulders straight, no visible weapons drawn, but that meant nothing out here. The most dangerous men were often the ones who did not need to show what they carried. Ethan stepped down from the porch, boots hitting the packed dirt with a soft thud, and took a few slow steps forward, enough to close the distance between himself and them by a yard or 2, enough to make it clear he was not hiding. The lead rider raised a hand, not a threat, not a greeting, just a signal, and the others stopped behind him, their horses settling into stillness like they had been trained for it. For a moment, no one spoke. The night held its breath between them. Then the lead rider shifted slightly in the saddle, just enough of the lantern light spilling from the cabin window to catch his face, and Ethan felt something tighten in his chest again, that same feeling from earlier, recognition brushing against memory without fully stepping into it. The man was older, lines etched deep around his eyes, hair pulled back, streaked with gray, his expression calm in a way that suggested he had seen more than most men ever would. When he spoke, his voice carried across the distance without effort. "You found her," he said, not asking, not accusing, just stating something that had already been decided long before he arrived. Ethan did not answer right away. He studied the man instead, the way he held himself, the way his eyes moved, not searching, not uncertain, but focused like he was looking at a piece of a puzzle he already understood. "She came to my land," Ethan said finally, his voice even measured. "That is all." The man nodded once, as if that answer fit into something he had already expected. "And you brought her inside," he continued, and again, it was not a question. Ethan felt the weight of the cabin behind him then, the presence of Lila just beyond the door, silent but not unaware, and for a second, he considered saying nothing at all. But silence, he knew, could speak louder than words out here. "She needed a place to rest," he said. The man's gaze held his for a moment longer, then shifted briefly toward the cabin, toward the faint light, before returning to Ethan. "Many men would have turned away," he said quietly. "It would have been easier." Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes steady. "I have never been interested in easy." Something almost like approval passed through the man's expression, subtle enough that most would have missed it, but Ethan caught it, the way you catch small changes in weather before a storm. Behind the lead rider, one of the others shifted slightly, and Ethan noticed then the detail he had not seen before, the markings on their clothing, not decoration, not for show, but something that carried meaning, something tied to a place, a people. Apache. The realization settled in without surprise, only confirmation. The man in front of him inclined his head slightly, a gesture that felt more like acknowledgement than respect. "She is not lost," he said, his voice softer now, but no less certain. "She is exactly where she was meant to be." Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, though his posture did not change. "That sounds like something a man says when he has already decided how this ends," he replied. The man's eyes held his again, and this time there was something deeper there, something that suggested the story was larger than the space between them. "It does not end here," he said. "It begins here." The wind moved again, brushing past them, carrying the faintest sound from inside the cabin, a floorboard shifting, a breath held too long. The man heard it. Ethan knew he did, but he did not look toward the door. Instead, he reached slowly into his coat, not for a weapon, not with urgency, and withdrew something small, something that caught the lantern light for just a second before he extended his hand forward. Ethan stepped closer without thinking, just enough to see it clearly, and when he did, the world seemed to narrow to that single point of light. A piece of silver, worn, familiar, the same design, the same stone, the same weight of memory pressing against his chest. Another necklace. The man did not speak. He did not need to. And in that quiet moment, standing between the dark land behind him and the dim light of the cabin where Lila waited, Ethan Cole understood something that made everything else feel smaller by comparison. This was not about a girl who needed shelter. This was about a connection that had been waiting to find him. And whatever choice he had made at the creek had already tied him to it. The silver caught the light again as the man held it steady between them, not offering it, not forcing it, just letting it exist in that space where truth did not need explanation, and Ethan found himself staring at it longer than he should have, because the shape of it, the curve of the wire around the stone, the small imperfection along the edge where it had once been repaired, all of it pulled something from his memory that refused to stay buried. He had seen two of them now, one on the girl inside his cabin, one in the hand of a man who had crossed miles of open land without urgency. That was not coincidence. That was design. Ethan lifted his eyes slowly, meeting the man's gaze again, and for the first time since they had arrived, there was something unspoken that passed between them, something that did not belong to threat or defense, but to recognition. "Where did you get that?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter now, less guarded, though not careless. The man did not lower his hand, did not break the moment. "It was given," he said simply. "Long ago." The answer settled into the night with a weight that made the air feel thicker, and Ethan knew better than to expect more from a man who chose his words like this one did. He nodded once, as if accepting what had not been said, and glanced back toward the cabin, toward the faint glow behind the window. "The girl has one," he said. "Same stone. Same work." The man's eyes shifted just slightly, not in surprise, not in doubt, but in confirmation, like a piece of a story falling into place exactly where it was meant to. "Yes," he said. "She does." Silence returned again, but it was different now, no longer uncertain, no longer searching, but waiting, like both men understood that the next words would carry more weight than anything that had come before. Behind Ethan, the door creaked softly, just enough to draw his attention, and he turned his head slightly to see Lila standing there, barefoot, on the threshold, the lantern light behind her casting her into shadow, her small frame outlined against the glow. She did not step forward. She did not hide. She simply stood, watching. The man on horseback saw her then, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression, something softer, something that did not belong to distance or control. He inclined his head slightly, not a bow, not submission, but acknowledgement, the kind given to someone whose presence mattered. "Lila," he said, her name spoken with care, as if it carried history. She did not answer. Her hand rested against the necklace at her throat, fingers curled around the stone like it was the only thing holding her steady, and her eyes moved once, briefly, from the man to Ethan, then back again. Ethan felt that movement more than he saw it, the weight of it settling somewhere deeper than he expected. "You know them," he said quietly, not asking her, not asking the man, but placing the truth between them. Lila's voice came soft, but clear enough to carry. "They came to make sure I was not alone." The words hung in the air, simple, but layered in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten again, because this was not about being found. This was about being watched, protected, guided. The man lowered his hand slowly, the second necklace disappearing back into the folds of his coat, and for a moment, the night felt darker without its faint reflection. "She was never meant to walk this land without someone seeing her," he said, his gaze still on Ethan. "Not alone." Ethan let that settle, his mind moving through it, turning it over, testing its edges. "And now she is here," he said, "on my land." The man nodded once. "Yes." Another pause. The wind moved again, carrying the scent of distant earth, the kind that comes before something changes. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, grounding himself in the familiar feel of dirt beneath his boots, the steady presence of the cabin behind him, the quiet reality of the life he had built far from everything that tried to pull a man into its current. "Then say what you came to say," he said finally. "You did not ride all this way to tell me what I can already see." The man studied him for a long moment, and there was something in that look that suggested he was measuring more than words, more than actions, something that reached deeper into the kind of choices that defined a man long before this moment. Then he spoke, his voice calm, but carrying something that made the night feel still. "There is a woman," he said, "a widow. She has been waiting." The words settled heavy between them, and Ethan felt it immediately, not because of what was said, but because of what it pulled from his memory. Margaret Halle. He did not speak her name, but it was there, clear as the ground beneath him. The man continued, his tone unchanged. "She sent no riders. She gave no orders. But the land listens to her. And when the girl moved, the land answered." Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, though his expression did not shift. "And you're that answer," he said. The man shook his head once, slow. "No," he replied. "I'm only a voice." The wind pressed against them again, softer this time, almost like a breath held and released, and behind Ethan, Lila stepped forward just one pace, enough that the lantern light touched her face, enough that the necklace at her throat caught the faint glow and answered it. Ethan saw it then, clearly, the same mark, the same stone, the same quiet weight of something that did not belong to chance. He looked from her to the man, then back again, and something inside him shifted, not fear, not resistance, but understanding that whatever line he thought he had been standing on had already been crossed the moment he stepped into that creek. "What does she want?" he asked, his voice low, steady, though the question carried more than curiosity. It carried consequence. The man held his gaze without hesitation. "She wants to see the man who chose not to turn away," he said. The words landed without force, but they did not need it. And in the quiet that followed, under a sky that seemed to press closer with every passing second, Ethan Cole realized that the night had not brought trouble to his door. It had brought a path, and whether he stepped onto it or not was no longer a question anyone else could answer for him. The words did not echo, but they stayed, settling into the space between them like dust that refused to fall, and Ethan stood there longer than a man should when given a simple choice, because nothing about this felt simple anymore. The riders did not move. The man did not press. Even the horses seemed to understand that whatever came next did not belong to them. Behind him, Lila remained at the doorway, close enough to step forward, far enough to leave him the decision. And that distance, that quiet respect for his choice, carried more weight than any demand ever could. Ethan let his gaze drift once more across the land he knew better than his own reflection. The fence lines stretching out into darkness, the low hills beyond, the familiar silence that had once been enough. It felt different now. Not broken, not threatened, just changed. He turned slightly, just enough to look back at Lila, and in the soft lantern glow he saw it clearly, not just the necklace, not just the guarded stillness she carried, but something else, something that did not belong to fear. Trust, not given easily, not given fully, but there, waiting. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like a man, setting something down he had carried longer than he realized. And when he looked back at the rider, his expression had settled into something quiet and certain. "How far?" he asked. The man did not hesitate. 3 miles past the dry ridge," he said, "where the land dips and the trees begin again." Ethan nodded once. He knew the place. Everyone did. It was not marked on any map, but men spoke of it in lowered voices, the way they spoke of things that did not belong to them. He turned back toward the cabin, stepping past Lila without stopping, pushing the door open wider as he entered, the familiar creak of the hinges grounding him for a moment in something steady. He reached for his coat, pulling it from a hook near the door, his movements calm, deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, as if he had already made this decision long before this night. Lila stepped inside behind him, watching, silent. "You are going," she said, not a question. Ethan shrugged the coat over his shoulders, adjusting it with a small tug. "Seems I am," he replied. She studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face, not for doubt, not for fear, but for something else, something he could not quite name. "You do not have to," she said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried something deeper, an understanding that choice still belonged to him, even now. Ethan paused, just for a second, his hand resting against the edge of the table, and then he shook his head slightly. "Already did," he said. He reached for the lantern, lifting it from the table, the flame flickering as it moved, casting long shadows across the walls, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath with him. Outside, the riders waited without impatience, without shifting, like they had all the time in the world, and that alone told Ethan more than anything else had. This was not a demand. This was an invitation, and those were always harder to refuse. He stepped back outside, the lantern light pushing into the darkness just enough to carve a path forward, and the man on horseback watched him with the same calm expression. No surprise, no triumph, just acknowledgement. "You will not need that," the man said, nodding slightly toward the lantern. Ethan glanced down at it, then back up, and after a moment he set it on the edge of the porch, the flame steady, marking the place he was leaving behind. The night felt different without it, deeper, but not empty. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the riders until he stood just within arm's reach of the lead horse. "I'll walk," he said. The man inclined his head once. "Then we ride slow," he replied. Ethan gave a small nod, and the riders shifted their horses just enough to make space, not surrounding him, not leading him, but moving with him, as if he had always been part of their path. Lila remained by the doorway, her small figure framed by the lantern light, watching as Ethan stepped away from the only place he had called his own for years, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, just as he reached the edge of the yard, her voice came, soft but steady. "You will come back," she said. Ethan stopped, just for a second, not turning fully, just enough to glance over his shoulder, and there was something in his expression then, something that had not been there before this night, something quieter. Then certainty, but stronger than doubt. "That depends," he said, "on what I find." The wind moved gently across the land as he continued forward, the riders falling into place beside him, their pace matching his without effort, and the cabin behind him grew smaller with each step, the lantern light fading into the dark until it was nothing more than a memory against the horizon. Ahead, the land stretched out into shadow, the outline of the dry ridge just visible against the sky, and beyond it, something waited, not hidden, not lost, but patient. Ethan walked without speaking, the sound of hooves beside him steady, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat that did not belong to him, and with every step, the life he had known felt further away, not gone, just behind him. The man beside him did not speak either, did not fill the silence with explanation or warning, and somehow, that made the path feel more real, more certain, as if words would only make it smaller than it was. They reached the base of the ridge after some time, the ground rising gently beneath their feet, the air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of trees somewhere beyond, and Ethan slowed slightly, his gaze lifting toward the horizon where the land dipped into darkness. He did not ask what waited there. He already knew it was not something that could be explained, and as he took the first step up the ridge, the sound of the world behind him fading into something distant, Ethan Cole understood one thing with quiet clarity. He was not being led to meet a woman. He was being led to meet a truth he had avoided long before this night ever began. The ridge rose slowly beneath his boots, each step pressing into loose gravel that shifted just enough to remind him he was leaving something steady behind, and the wind changed as they climbed, no longer carrying the dry, open scent of his land, but something cooler, something older, like the air itself remembered things the plains had forgotten. The riders moved beside him without a word, their horses adjusting to the incline with quiet precision, hooves finding ground where there barely seemed to be any, and Ethan kept his eyes forward, not out of caution, but because looking back would have made the distance feel real in a way. He was not ready to measure. The top of the ridge came without announcement, the slope leveling into a stretch of dark earth that dropped gently into a shallow valley beyond. And there, just as the man had said, the land changed. Trees, not many, not dense, but enough to break the horizon, their silhouettes rising against the night like something placed there on purpose, not growing wild, but standing watch. Ethan slowed without meaning to, his steps shortening as he took in the shift. The way the ground beneath his feet felt firmer, the way the wind softened as it passed through branches instead of empty air. "This place," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, and the man beside him gave a small nod, as if the land itself had answered. "It is not marked," the man said, "but it is known." Ethan let that settle, his gaze moving across the valley, tracing the faint outlines of paths that were not roads, of spaces between trees that felt intentional, like something had shaped this place without leaving a mark that most men would recognize. They moved down the slope together, slower now, the horses stepping carefully as the ground dipped, and with each yard, the silence changed again, not empty, not quiet in the way of open land, but filled with something subtle, something that pressed gently against the senses without making a sound. Ethan felt it before he understood it, the way a man feels eyes on him before he sees them. Not threatening, not hidden, just present. He did not reach for his gun. He did not speak. He simply walked. At the edge of the trees, the lead rider lifted his hand again, and this time, the others stopped completely, their horses settling into stillness as if they had reached a line they would not cross. Ethan took one more step before he realized he was the only one still moving, and he paused, glancing back briefly, the question unspoken. The man met his gaze, calm as ever. "From here," he said, "you walk alone." Ethan studied him for a moment, searching for something in his expression that might suggest doubt or warning, but there was none. Only certainty. He nodded once, turning back toward the trees, and stepped forward. The ground beneath him softened slightly as he crossed into the shadow of the first branch, the scent of wood and earth rising around him, and the air felt cooler here, quieter in a way that made every small sound seem larger than it should have been. His boots moved carefully now, not out of fear, but out of respect for a place that did not belong to him, and the path, if it could be called that, revealed itself slowly, a line of slightly pressed earth winding between the trunks, leading deeper without ever seeming obvious. He followed it without question. The deeper he went, the more the world behind him faded, the open sky narrowing into thin strips between branches, the sound of wind replaced by the faint rustle of leaves, and then, after a distance he could not measure, he saw it. A light, not bright, not flickering like his lantern, steady, warm, set low to the ground, just beyond a cluster of trees that opened into a small clearing. Ethan slowed again, his breath steady, his steps quieter, and as he reached the edge of that clearing, he stopped completely. She stood there, not far from the light, her figure still against the soft glow, dressed in dark fabric that moved gently with the night air, her posture straight, not rigid, not guarded, but composed in a way that made everything around her feel arranged, intentional. Margaretale. He did not need to hear her name. He did not need to see her face clearly. Something about her presence carried its own introduction. The same quiet authority he remembered, the same stillness that made the world adjust itself around her rather than the other way around. She did not step forward. She did not speak right away. She simply watched him, her gaze steady, measuring, not with suspicion, but with something deeper, something that seemed to look past the man standing in front of her and into the choices that had brought him there. Ethan remained where he was, a few yards from the edge of the light, not stepping closer, not stepping back, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them was not empty. It was full. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice calm, clear, carrying easily through the space between them. "You took her in," she said. Not a question. Ethan inclined his head slightly, the smallest acknowledgement. "She came to my land," he replied. Margaret's gaze did not waver. "Many men would have closed their door," she said. Ethan's expression remained unchanged. "I am not many men." Something shifted in her eyes then, not surprise, not approval, but recognition, like a piece of something she had been waiting for had finally settled into place. She took a single step forward, the light catching her face now, revealing features marked not by age alone, but by time lived with purpose, with loss, with something that had shaped her into more than what the town remembered. "No," she said quietly. "You are not." The words lingered, soft but certain, and as the night held its breath around them, Ethan Cole understood that whatever he had thought this meeting would be, it was not that. It was something else entirely, something that had been waiting long before he ever stepped into that creek. She did not move closer after that step, and somehow that distance between them felt deliberate, like a line drawn not to divide, but to define what this moment was meant to be. Ethan stood just outside the reach of the light, where shadow still held him, and for a second he wondered if that was how she preferred it, to see a man before he chose where to stand. The flame at her side burned steady, no flicker, no struggle against the night air, and it cast a quiet glow across the clearing that made everything feel smaller, contained, as if the rest of the world had been set aside for this one conversation. "You know my name," Ethan said after a moment, not as a challenge, not as a demand, just placing the truth between them the way she had done before. Margaret's gaze did not shift. "I know the kind of man who lives alone on land that others pass by," she said, "and I know what it takes to remain there. Her voice carried no weight of judgment, no edge, only observation. And Ethan found himself holding her gaze longer than he intended, because there was something in the way she spoke that made words feel unnecessary. "And the girl," he said, his tone quiet but steady, "she wears what you wear." Margaret's eyes lowered briefly, not in avoidance, but in acknowledgement, her hand lifting just enough to touch the edge of a silver piece hidden beneath. The fold of her clothing, the motion small, almost instinctive. "She carries what was given," she replied. "As do I." The answer settled, simple, but layered, and Ethan took a slow breath, the scent of earth and wood grounding him as his thoughts moved through the pieces he had been given. "You sent no one," he said. "Yet they came." Margaret lifted her gaze again, and this time there was something softer in it, something that belonged to understanding rather than explanation. "Not everything that moves needs to be called," she said. "Some things listen." The wind shifted slightly, brushing through the trees in a low, steady whisper, and Ethan felt it then, clearer than before, the presence that had followed him into this place. Not close, not pressing, but there, like the land itself, had become aware of him. He did not turn. He did not search for it. He simply stood, letting it exist without needing to name it. "Why bring me here?" he asked after a moment. Margaret did not answer immediately. Instead, she studied him again, the way she had when he first stepped into the clearing, her eyes moving not across his face, but through it, as if she was measuring something that could not be seen. "Because you did not turn away," she said finally. Ethan let out a quiet breath, something almost like a humorless smile, touching the edge of his expression. "That seems to matter more than it should," he replied. Margaret tilted her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in consideration. "It matters exactly as much as it should," she said. "Out here, a man is known by what he refuses to ignore." The words settled into him, not heavy, not forced, just present, and for a moment, the silence returned, but it was no longer uncertain. It was steady. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, his boots pressing into the earth, grounding him in something real, something familiar. "You said she was not lost," he said. "Then what is she?" Margaret's gaze softened again, just enough to change the way the light touched her face. "She is a bridge," she said, "between what was and what still can be." Ethan's brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in the effort of understanding something that did not fit neatly into the world he had built for himself. "That sounds like something that gets a person into trouble," he said. Margaret's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to carry the shape of one. "Only if the world refuses to change," she replied. The wind moved again, and this time it carried something else with it, a faint shift in the air that made the clearing feel different, as if something unseen had taken one step closer, not to intrude, but to witness. Ethan felt it, the same way he had felt the riders before he saw them, the same way he had felt the girl before she spoke, and he understood then that this place was not empty. It was watching. "And me," he said, his voice lower now. "What am I in this?" Margaret did not look away. "That," she said quietly, "depends on what you choose next." The answer hung between them, simple, but carrying more weight than anything else she had said, and Ethan found himself standing still, not because he did not understand, but because he did. Choice. It had always come back to that. The creek, the cabin, the door he did not close, the path he chose to walk. None of it had been forced. None of it had been taken from him. He had stepped into it. And now, standing in a place that did not belong to maps or towns or the rules men try to write for each other, he felt that same quiet moment again, the one where everything that came after would grow from what he decided here. "If I walk away," he said slowly, "what happens to her?" Margaret's gaze did not waver. "She will continue," she said, "with or without you." There was no threat in it, no attempt to sway him, just truth. Ethan nodded once, accepting it, and for a second, he looked past her, into the darkness beyond the light, into the place where the trees thickened and the night seemed to hold more than shadow. He could leave. He could turn back, walk the ridge, return to his cabin, to the quiet life that asked nothing more from him than endurance. The path behind him still existed. Nothing had closed it. He looked back at her. "And if I stay?" he asked. Margaret's eyes held his, steady, certain, and for the first time since he had entered the clearing, there was something in her voice that carried the faintest edge of something deeper than calm. Not urgency, not pressure, but meaning. "Then you stop standing at the edge of a story that has already begun," she said. The wind stilled for a moment, the leaves quiet, the air settling into something that felt almost like stillness before dawn, and Ethan Cole understood, with a clarity that did not need words, that whatever life he had built alone had just been offered something that would change it in ways he could not yet see. And for the first time in years, he did not look away. The silence after her words did not feel empty. It felt full, like the moment just before the sun breaks the horizon when everything holds its breath without knowing why. And Ethan stood there with that weight resting on his chest, not heavy enough to crush him, but too real to ignore. He did not answer her right away. Not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that anything spoken too quickly would belong to habit, not truth, and this place did not seem built for habits. The flame beside Margaret remained steady, casting a soft circle of light that reached just far enough to touch the ground between them, leaving the edges of the clearing in shadow. And in that narrow space, Ethan felt something shift inside him, something quiet but undeniable, like a door he had closed years ago had been left open without him noticing. He took one step forward, just enough to leave the shadow behind him, and the light caught the edge of his coat, the worn fabric, the dust of his land still clinging to it. And for a brief second, it felt like two worlds had met on his shoulders without asking permission. Margaret did not move. She simply watched him cross that line, her gaze steady, not surprised, not relieved, just present. "You speak like this was always meant to happen," Ethan said, his voice low, but no longer guarded. Margaret's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened again, not toward him, but toward the space between them, as if she was acknowledging something larger than both of them. "Not meant," she said, aloud. The words settled differently, quieter, deeper, and Ethan let it sit there, turning it over. In his mind, feeling its shape rather than trying to force it into meaning. "Allowed by who?" he asked. Margaret's gaze lifted slightly, not to the sky, not to anything visible, but just enough to suggest that the answer did not belong to a single place. "By those who choose to see," she said. Ethan let out a slow breath, something close to a quiet exhale of understanding, though not complete, not yet, and he glanced briefly toward the edge of the clearing, where the trees stood still, their dark forms unmoving, yet somehow not empty. "You said she is a bridge," he continued, "between what was and what can be." Margaret inclined her head slightly. "Yes." Ethan's jaw tightened just a fraction, not in resistance, but in thought. "Bridges do not stand alone," he said. Margaret's eyes returned to him fully, and for the first time, there was something like recognition that reached deeper than before. "No," she said, "they do not." The air between them shifted again, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but enough that Ethan felt it, the way a man feels the ground settle beneath him before he realizes he has taken a step forward. He looked down briefly at the earth beneath his boots, then back up, his gaze clearer now, steadier. "Then why me?" he asked. Margaret did not hesitate this time. "Because you did not ask that question when it mattered most," she said. Ethan held her gaze, the answer landing in a place he could not quite reach with words, because he understood what she meant. The creek. The moment he chose without asking why. The door he opened without weighing the cost. Those had not been questions. They had been decisions. And now, standing here, he was asking after the fact, as if the answer could change what had already begun. He nodded once, slowly. "So this was never about the girl," he said. Margaret's expression shifted slightly, not disagreement, not correction, but refinement. "It was always about the girl," she said. "But not only the girl." The words carried a quiet balance, and Ethan found himself almost smiling, not out of humor, but out of recognition of something that refused to be simple. "And the town," he said after a moment. "They will not see it this way." Margaret's gaze did not waver. The town sees what it fears, she said, and fears what it does not understand. Ethan let out a soft breath through his nose, something that might have been agreement. Then they will come, he said. Margaret did not deny it. She did not confirm it. She simply held his gaze, and in that silence, Ethan realized that whether they came or not did not change what stood in front of him now. The choice remained the same. The path remained the same. Only his place on it could shift. He glanced once more toward the trees, toward the unseen presence that had followed him into this place. And this time, he did not feel watched. He felt included. The difference was small, but it changed everything. He stepped fully into the light, then, closing the distance between himself and Margaret until only a few feet remained. And for the first time since he had arrived, he was no longer standing at the edge of something. He was inside it. If I stay, he said quietly, I do not stay for a story. Margaret's eyes held his, steady certain. No, she said, you stay for what the story becomes. Ethan nodded once, the movement small but final, and in that moment, something inside him settled, not into comfort, not into certainty, but into acceptance of a path that no longer needed explanation. The wind moved again, softer now, brushing through the clearing like a breath released, and the flame beside them flickered just once before steadying again, as if acknowledging what had just passed between them. Somewhere beyond the trees, far behind the ridge, the world he had left continued as it always had, unchanged, unaware, but here, in this quiet place that did not belong to maps or names, something had shifted, something that would not be undone by distance or time. Ethan Cole did not look back. He did not need to, because for the first time in years, he was no longer standing where he had always been. He was standing where he had chosen to be. The night did not change after his choice, not in any way a man could point to, but something beneath it settled, like a long-held breath finally released into the dark, and Ethan stood there in the clearing with the quiet understanding that nothing around him needed to shift for everything to be different. Margaret watched him for a moment longer, then turned slightly, not away from him, but toward the far side of the clearing where the trees opened into a narrow path that seemed to exist only when you were close enough to see it. Come, she said, her voice calm, not commanding, not inviting, simply stating the next step as if it had already been taken. Ethan followed without hesitation, his boots pressing into the soft earth, the sound muted beneath the canopy of branches, and as they moved deeper, the light behind them faded, replaced by a softer glow ahead, not from flame, but from something else, something that felt older, steadier, like the ground itself carried it. The path curved gently, never straight, weaving between trees that stood close enough to guide but not to confine, and after a short distance, the space opened again into a wider clearing, larger than the first, the ground smooth, worn by time rather than use. At its center stood a low structure, built from wood and stone, simple in form but precise in its placement, as if it had been set there not by hands alone, but by intention. A small fire burned near its entrance, the flame low, controlled, casting a warm circle of light that did not reach far beyond its edge. Ethan slowed as they approached, his eyes taking in the details, the way the stones were arranged, the way they would fit together without excess, everything carrying a sense of purpose that did not need to be explained. This is where she waits, Margaret said quietly. Ethan nodded once, though he had already felt it, the same presence he had noticed before, stronger here, not pressing, not overwhelming, but undeniable. He stepped closer, stopping just at the edge of the firelight, and for a moment, nothing moved. Then the door of the structure opened slowly, without sound, and Lila stepped out. She did not look surprised to see him. She did not look relieved either. She simply walked forward until she stood within the circle of light, the necklace at her throat catching the glow, the silver reflecting softly against her skin. Ethan watched her, the distance between them smaller now, but carrying more meaning than before. You knew I would come, he said, not accusing, not questioning, just placing the truth where it belonged. Lila's eyes met his, steady, clear. I knew. You would not turn away again, she said. The words settled into him with a quiet weight, not heavy, but certain, and he nodded once, accepting them without argument. Margaret stepped to the side then, not leaving but giving space, the kind that allowed something else to take shape without interruption. Lila reached up slowly, her fingers touching the necklace, and for a brief moment, her expression shifted, something softer, something that carried memory rather than distance. "This was not mine," she said, her voice low but steady. "It was given to me when I crossed from one place to another." Ethan's brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in focus. "By who?" he asked. Lila's gaze moved briefly toward Margaret, then back to him. "By the one who carries the same," she said. Ethan glanced at Margaret, the connection settling into place with a clarity that did not need further explanation. "Then it ties you to her," he said. Lila shook her head gently. "It ties me to something larger," she replied. The fire shifted slightly, a small crackle breaking the stillness, and Ethan felt that same awareness again, stronger now, not distant, not hidden, but present in a way that made the clearing feel like the center of something rather than a place apart from everything else. "You said she is a bridge," he said, his voice quieter now. "What does it lead to?" Margaret stepped forward again, her presence returning to the space between them, her gaze moving from Lila to Ethan with calm certainty. "It leads to a choice that has been waiting longer than either of you," she said. Ethan held her gaze, the words settling into him, not as something new, but as something that had been there all along, waiting for him to recognize it. "And the town," he said after a moment, "they will not understand this." Margaret's expression did not change. "No," she said, "they will not." Ethan let out a slow breath, the weight of that truth settling into him, but not pulling him back, not turning him away. "Then they will come," he said again, this time not as a question, not even as a concern, just as something that existed alongside everything else. Margaret nodded once. "Yes," she said, "they will." The firelight flickered softly, casting shadows that moved along the edges of the clearing, and Ethan looked. From Margaret to Lila, then back again, the connections between them no longer unclear, no longer distant, but real, present, unavoidable. "And when they do," he said slowly, "what happens then?" Lila's voice came first, soft but certain. "That depends on whether they see," she said. Ethan's gaze shifted to Margaret. "And if they do not?" Margaret held his eyes, her expression steady, her voice calm. "Then someone will have to stand where they refuse to." The words did not rise, did not carry force, but they settled deeper than anything else she had said, and Ethan felt them take root in a place he had kept closed for a long time. He looked at the fire, at the steady flame that did not waver despite the night around it, then back at the two figures before him, one carrying the future, the other holding the past, and for a moment he saw the space between them not as distance, but as something waiting to be crossed. He did not step forward. Not yet, but he did not step back either. And in that stillness, with the firelight steady and the night holding quiet around them, Ethan Cole understood that what lay ahead was not something he could prepare for, not something he could control. It was something he would have to stand inside, fully, without turning away, the same way he had at the creek, the same way he had at his door. And this time, there would be no going back to who he had been before he chose. The fire burned low, steady, and patient, as if it understood that what mattered here was not heat or light, but presence. And Ethan stood at its edge with that same quiet awareness settling deeper into him, the kind that did not come from words, but from knowing when something had reached a point where it could not be undone. The night held still around them, the trees unmoving, the air calm, and for a moment it felt like the world beyond the ridge had paused without permission, waiting for something to happen in this place before continuing on its own path. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the ground firm beneath his boots, and lifted his gaze toward the dark line of trees beyond the clearing, not searching, not expecting, but listening in the way a man does when he knows something is coming long before it arrives. He felt it first, not as sound, not as movement, but as a change in the air, a tightening, subtle but undeniable, like the space itself had drawn in a breath and had not yet released it. Lila felt it too. He could see it in the way her hand moved instinctively to the necklace at her throat, her fingers curling around the stone, not in fear, but in recognition. Margaret did not move at all. She stood as she had before, composed, steady, her gaze lifting slightly toward the direction of the ridge, as if she had been expecting this moment from the start. Then, faint at first, the sound came. Hoofbeats. Distant, uneven, not the measured rhythm of the riders who had come for Ethan, but faster, less controlled, carrying with it something sharper, something that did not belong to patience. Ethan did not turn fully. He did not step back. He simply angled his body slightly toward the sound, placing himself without thinking between Lila and the direction it came from. The movement small, almost unnoticed, but complete. Margaret saw it. She did not comment. The sound grew clearer, closer, echoing faintly through the trees as it climbed the ridge and moved down into the valley beyond. And with it came something else. Voices carried on the wind, not loud enough to make out words, but enough to tell him what he already knew. The town had come. Ethan let out a slow breath, his chest rising and falling once, steady, controlled, and he glanced briefly at Margaret. "You knew," he said, not accusing, not surprised. Margaret's eyes remained on the darkness beyond the clearing. "I knew they would follow what they do not understand," she replied. Ethan nodded once. That fit. That always fit. The hoofbeats slowed as they reached the edge of the trees, the riders beyond adjusting their pace as the land changed beneath them. And for a moment, there was a pause, the kind that comes when men reach a place they do not fully trust, a place that does not belong to them. Then the first figure appeared between the trunks, a shape moving into the edge of the clearing, stopping just short of the firelight. Ethan recognized him immediately. Sheriff Brennan. The man's posture was tight, his shoulders held a little too high, his hand resting near his belt not out of readiness, but out of uncertainty, and behind him several others gathered, their faces hard to read in the dim light, but their presence clear enough. They did not step forward. Not yet. "Cole," Brennan called out, his voice carrying across the clearing, not loud, but edged with something that did not sit comfortably on him. "You have something that does not belong here." Ethan did not answer right away. He let the words settle, not in the air, but in the space between what was said and what was meant, and then he took one step forward, just enough to bring himself fully into the light of the fire, where he could be seen clearly, without shadow, without doubt. "She is not something," Ethan said, his voice calm, steady, carrying no force, but no hesitation either. Brennan shifted slightly, the movement small but telling, his eyes flicking briefly toward Margaret, then back to Ethan. "You know what I mean," he said. Ethan held his gaze. "I do," he replied. "And you are still wrong." The silence that followed was not empty. It stretched, tight, fragile, like something that could break if pushed too far, and behind Brennan, one of the men shifted in the saddle, the leather creaking softly in the quiet. "That girl brings trouble," Brennan continued, his voice firmer now, though it carried the same uncertainty beneath it. "The town has already decided." Ethan's expression did not change. "The town decides many things," he said. "It does not make them right." The words landed without weight, but they did not need it, and Brennan's jaw tightened slightly, the conflict in him visible now, not hidden behind authority, but exposed by it. He looked again toward Margaret, and this time his gaze held longer, something like hesitation passing through his eyes. "You should not be here," he said, though whether he meant Ethan or her was not entirely clear. Margaret stepped forward then, just enough to stand beside Ethan, not behind him, not in front, but with him, her presence calm, unshaken, her gaze meeting Brennan's without resistance. "And yet we are," she said. Her voice did not rise. It did not press, but it carried something that made the air itself seem to settle around her words, something that did not ask for agreement, but did not leave room for dismissal either. Brennan held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at Ethan, and in that exchange, something shifted, not in the clearing, not in the night, but in him. "This does not have to go further," he said, quieter now, less certain. Ethan nodded once. "Then do not take it further," he replied. Another silence. Deeper this time. The kind that forces a man to hear his own thoughts whether he wants to or not. The wind moved gently through the trees, brushing past the edges of the clearing, and the fire flickered once, casting shadows that stretched and pulled before settling again. No one moved. No one reached for anything. And in that stillness, with the town at one edge and something older at the other, Ethan Cole stood exactly where he needed to be, not because he had planned it, not because he understood it, but because he had chosen it. And for the first time, that was enough. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted slowly like a line in the sand being redrawn without anyone stepping forward, and Ethan stood there between two worlds that refused to move closer, each waiting for the other to decide what came next. Sheriff Brennan's hand lowered slightly from his belt. Not fully, not enough to signal ease, but enough to show that something inside him had begun to question the path he had ridden in on. The men behind him remained still, their horses restless in small ways, hooves adjusting, breath visible in the cooling air, but none of them pushed forward, none of them crossed into the firelight. They stayed at the edge. That mattered. Ethan saw it. Margaret saw it. Even Lila, standing just behind him, felt in the way her shoulders eased just slightly, not relaxed, but no longer braced. "You are asking us to walk away," Brennan said finally, his voice quieter now, less certain of the authority it tried to carry. Ethan did not turn his head. His eyes stayed forward, steady on the man who had come to enforce something he no longer fully believed in. "I'm asking you to see," Ethan replied. The words were simple, but they landed differently than anything else he had said, because they did not push, they did not argue, they did not defend. They invited. Brennan's brow tightened slightly, his gaze shifting again, this time not just between Ethan and Margaret, but toward Lila, toward the small figure who stood without fear, without retreat, her presence not challenging, not threatening, but undeniable. "She is Apache," Brennan said, and the word hung there, heavy with everything the town had placed inside it over the years. Ethan nodded once. "She is," he said. Brennan exhaled, the breath visible in the night air, and for a moment it seemed like he might step forward, like he might try to force the moment into something simpler, something clearer. But he did not. Instead, he stayed where he was, caught between what he had been told and what he was beginning to see. Margaret stepped forward just slightly then, not enough to close the distance, but enough to make her presence unmistakable, her voice calm, steady, carrying across the clearing without effort. "And you are a man who has spent years deciding who belongs and who does not," she said. Brennan's gaze snapped to her, not in anger, but in something closer to recognition, like he had been waiting for someone to say it out loud. "That is my job," he replied, though the words lacked the certainty they once held. Margaret inclined her head slightly. "No," she said, "that is what you have been told your job is." The fire crackled softly, the sound small, but it filled the space between them in a way that made everything else feel sharper, clearer, and Ethan felt it then, the shift, not in the clearing, not in the night, but in the men at its edge. One of them lowered his gaze. Another adjusted in his saddle, not to prepare, but to think. Small movements, quiet ones, but they mattered. Brennan's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking once more toward Ethan, searching, measuring, and for the first time since he had arrived, there was no accusation left in them. Only uncertainty. "You are standing with them," Brennan said, and it was not a challenge anymore. It was a realization. Ethan nodded once. "I'm standing where I should have stood a long time ago," he said. The words came without force, without pride, just truth, and something in Brennan's posture shifted again, his shoulders lowering just enough to change the shape of the man sitting there. He looked past Ethan then, toward Lila, really. Looked this time, not as a symbol, not as a threat, but as a person, and in that moment, something quiet passed through his expression, something that did not belong to law or order or fear. Something human. The wind moved gently through the clearing, brushing past them all, and for a brief second, it felt like the world itself had leaned in to listen. No one spoke. No one moved. And then, slowly, Brennan pulled his hand away from his belt completely, letting it rest at his side, the gesture small but final. The men behind him followed, not all at once, not in unison, but one by one, as if each needed to make that choice on his own. No one said anything about it. No one needed to. Ethan watched it happen without reacting, without stepping forward, without claiming anything. He simply stood. Brennan exhaled again, longer this time, the tension leaving him in a way that could not be hidden. "The town will not understand this," he said, his voice low, almost to himself. Margaret's gaze softened just slightly. "Not today," she replied. Brennan nodded once, slowly, as if accepting something he had not known he was carrying. He looked back at Ethan one last time, and this time, there was no question left in his eyes. Only acknowledgement. "You are choosing a hard road," he said. Ethan's expression did not change. "It was always there," he replied. Brennan held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned his horse with a quiet motion. Not abrupt, not forced, just a shift in direction that carried everything with it. The men behind him followed, one after another, their horses turning away from the clearing, from the firelight, from the moment that had not broken into conflict, but had changed something deeper. The sound of hooves faded slowly, not rushed, not scattered, but steady, until it disappeared beyond the trees and into the distance they had come from. The clearing grew still again. The fire burned as it had before. The night settled back into itself, but nothing was the same. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, watching the space where they had been, not to make sure they were gone, but to understand what had just happened. Then he let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing just slightly, not in relief, but in acceptance. Behind him, Lila stepped forward, just one step, and Margaret remained where she was, her presence steady, unchanged, as if she had known all along that this would not end with raised voices or drawn lines, but with something quieter, something harder. Ethan did not turn immediately. He did not need to, because for the first time, the silence did not feel like something he was standing against. It felt like something he was standing within, and that made all the difference. The clearing did not rush back to normal after the riders disappeared. It settled slowly, like dust falling through still air, and Ethan remained where he stood, his eyes resting on the empty space at the edge of the trees, not watching for their return, but acknowledging that something had passed through and left its mark without leaving a trace. The fire continued its quiet burn, steady and unchanged, and for a moment, it seemed like the only thing in the world that had not shifted. Behind him, Lila stepped closer, her movement light, careful, but no longer distant, and when she stopped at his side, she did not look at the place where the men had been. She looked at him. That mattered. Ethan felt it before he turned, the weight of her gaze not pressing, not demanding, but present in a way that asked nothing and yet held everything. He shifted slightly, just enough to face her, and in the soft light, he saw it clearly now, not just the necklace, not just the quiet strength in her posture, but the absence of fear that had once lived behind her eyes. It was not gone. It had changed. Margaret watched them both, her presence steady as ever, not stepping forward, not stepping back, as if she understood that this moment did not belong to her to guide, only to witness. "They left," Lila said softly. Ethan nodded once. "They did," he replied. Her gaze held his for a moment longer, then shifted briefly toward the fire, toward the steady flame that had not faltered through any of it. "They will come again," she said, not with worry, not with certainty, but with the kind of understanding that comes from knowing how the world moves. Ethan did not deny it. He did not confirm it. He simply looked at her, his expression calm, settled. "Then we will be here," he said. The words were simple, but they carried something deeper now, something that had not been there before this night. Not just resolve, but belonging. Lila studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if accepting something she had already begun to believe. Margaret stepped forward then, closing the space just enough to stand beside them, her gaze moving from one to the other, not measuring, not weighing, but recognizing what had taken shape between them. "The first step is always the quietest," she said. Ethan glanced at her, the words settling into him with a clarity that did not need explanation. "And the rest?" he asked. Margaret's lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, but close enough to carry its meaning. "The rest is living with what you have already chosen," she replied. The fire crackled softly, a small sound that seemed louder now in the absence of everything else, and Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing just slightly, not in relief, but in acceptance of something that no longer felt like a burden. He looked once more toward the trees, toward the path that had brought him here, the ridge beyond it, the land he had called his own for years. And for a brief moment he saw it differently, not as something separate, not as something he had left behind, but as part of a larger shape he had never allowed himself to see. "What happens now?" he said quietly. Margaret's gaze followed his for a moment, then returned to him. "Now," she said, "you stop waiting for something to come and start being part of what is already here." Ethan nodded once, the words settling into him with a quiet certainty, and he turned back toward the fire, stepping closer, the warmth reaching him not as comfort, but as something steady, something real. Lila moved with him, not behind, not ahead, but beside, her presence no longer tentative, no longer uncertain. The three of them stood there for a moment, the firelight holding them in a small circle that felt larger than it should have been, and beyond it, the night remained still, not empty, but watchful in a way that no longer felt distant. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the faintest hint of dawn not yet visible, not yet formed, but coming, the kind of change that does not announce itself, only arrives when it is ready. Ethan lowered himself slowly onto a low stone near the fire, the motion unhurried, grounded, and for the first time since he had stepped into the creek, there was no question left in him about where he stood. Not because everything was clear, not because the path ahead was easy, but because he was no longer standing alone. Lila sat beside him, her hands resting loosely in her lap, the necklace catching the light in small, steady reflections, and Margaret remained standing, her presence calm, her gaze lifting briefly toward the edge of the clearing as if she could already see what would come next, even if it had not yet arrived. Ethan followed her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the fire, at the simple, steady flame that had not wavered through any of it, and he understood something then, something that did not need words, something that would not leave him. Out here, nothing changed all at once. Not people, not places, not the lines that divided one from another. But sometimes, in a quiet clearing, under a sky that did not ask permission, a man could step into something that had been waiting for him long before he knew to look for it. And when he did, the world did not have to move, because he already had. Morning did not arrive all at once. It slipped in quietly, the kind of light that does not wake a man, but finds him already awake, and Ethan sat by the dying fire as the first pale stretch of dawn moved through the trees, turning shadows into shapes and shapes into something real again. The night had passed without words, without movement that needed to be marked, and yet everything felt different, not in the land, not in the air, but in the space he carried inside himself. Lila remained beside him, her breathing slow, steady, not asleep, not restless, just present in the same way the fire had been, and Margaret stood a short distance away, her figure outlined by the soft morning light, her gaze turned outward toward the ridge, as if she could already see the day unfolding beyond it. Ethan did not rush to stand. He did not reach for anything. He simply watched the light come in the way. It settled over the clearing without asking permission, and for the first time in years, he did not feel the need to measure what the day would take from him. He already knew what he had given. That was enough. "It looks different," Lila said softly, her voice barely rising above the quiet of the morning. Ethan nodded once, his eyes still on the horizon beyond the trees. "It is," he replied. She turned slightly, studying him, and there was something in her expression now that had not been there when he first found her by the creek. Not caution, not distance, but a quiet certainty that had taken root without either of them naming it. "You are staying?" she said. Again, not a question. Ethan let out a slow breath, the cool air of dawn filling his chest, and this time, when he answered, there was no weight in it, no hesitation. "I am," he said. Margaret turned then, her gaze moving from the ridge back to them, and for a moment, The three of them stood in the soft light, not as strangers drawn together by chance, but as something else, something that did not need to be defined to be understood. "Then it begins," she said quietly. Ethan glanced at her, a faint shift in his expression, not confusion, not resistance, but acknowledgement. "It already did," he replied. Margaret inclined her head slightly, accepting that without correction, and for a brief moment, something like approval passed through her eyes, not spoken, not offered, just present. The wind moved gently through the clearing, carrying with it the faint scent of the plains beyond the ridge, the world he had known still there, unchanged, waiting in the same way it always had. But it did not pull at him anymore. It did not call him back. It simply existed alongside what stood in front of him now. Ethan rose slowly, brushing the dust from his coat with a small motion that felt more like habit than necessity, and stepped toward the edge of the clearing, his eyes tracing the path that would lead him back if he chose to take it. He did not step onto it. He simply looked. Then he turned away. Lila stood as well, her movements light, sure, and she stepped forward until she stood where he had been sitting, her gaze following his fore. A moment before returning to the fire, now nothing more than a soft glow beneath the ash. She reached down, adjusting one of the small stones around it with a careful hand, not because it needed it, but because she understood something about keeping what mattered in place. Ethan watched her for a moment, then looked at Margaret. "The town," he said. Margaret's expression remained calm. "They will speak," she said. "They will question. They will return to what they know." Ethan nodded once. "And we?" he asked. Margaret met his gaze, steady, certain. "We remain," she said. The simplicity of it settled into him deeper than anything else, because it did not ask for more than what had already been given. It did not demand action or proof. It simply required presence. Ethan looked once more toward the ridge, then back to the clearing, to the fire, to the two figures who now stood within the same quiet space he had stepped into, and for a moment, everything aligned in a way that did not need explanation. No grand gesture, no final word, just a man who had stopped walking away. The sun rose higher, the light growing stronger, pushing the last of the shadows back into the trees, and the clearing held it all without resistance, the same way it had held the night, the same way it would hold whatever came next. Ethan Cole did not reach for his gun. He did not look for a fight. He did not prepare for anything at all. He simply stood where he had chosen to stand. And out here, that was enough. Because out here, justice did not come riding fast or loud. It came quietly. It came in the space between what a man could do and what he chose not to turn away from.